This week, the federal government issued 218 policy changes. Of those policy changes, 36.2% benefited megacorporations, billionaires, and big business. By comparison, small business only benefited by 4.2%. The self-employed benefited from roughly 12%. And of course, but only 0.5% of those were actually directly targeting the self-employed. The other things were just stuff that they happen to overlap with big businesses because they're a business. And similarly, if we look at farmers were also left out. They only had 2.8% of the policies benefiting them in any way. And they didn't have benefits that they garnered from overlapping with small business, self-employed, and independent contractors, or big business. That takes some talent to actually accomplish. State, local, and tribal governments were each in some way benefiting from 10.1% of these policies, mostly from overlapping conditions with them and other targeted groups that they were actually helping. Only 7.8% actually targeted state, local, and tribal governments. This is strange because when you really think about it, one of the big motives, according to the administration, is that they are taking roles away from the federal government and giving them back to the states or other levels of government. And of course, the past week's policy action doesn't support this. It actually supports that they're just stopping the federal government from doing those actions, but not actually reallocating them to the states or other agencies, other groups. Only about 0.9%, we can just call it 1, only about 1% of policies could be classified as benefiting the rights of individuals. All of those, that 30-odd percent, 36%, roughly 2/3 of the policies that were established that benefited megacorporations and things like that. But when it came to individual citizens, only about 1% actually benefited them. Largely, the average citizen's rights were not promoted by policies this week. Similarly, only about 1% of the policies benefited education. And those who needed things like social benefits, people like retirees and the disabled, they were only targeted in 1.5% of the policies that were issued. The natural environment only benefited from 2.8% of these policies, and like farmers, largely had no indirect benefits from other policies. Again, something that is pretty difficult to accomplish. Public health and patients benefited directly from 6.5% of policies that were issued, with indirect benefits raising that percentage to roughly 8.7%. Now, if we take and we just look, I'm going to look at 3 sectors that are of concern in today's world. One is jobs, the other is inflation, and the other is the environment. And I could have picked other things, but I'm going to focus on these 3 for now. If we were to take and put on a scale of 1 to 5 how policies this past week helped jobs, I'd have to give it a 3.4. The week's policy mix leans very, very mildly toward employment and support to employment supporting activity. There are numerous actions aimed at reducing business compliance costs and by basically eliminating the requirements, and also encouraging infrastructure and investment, providing disaster and agricultural assistance, and removing barriers to development. However, deregulation doesn't necessarily mean more jobs. Some deregulation can reduce employment in the regulated programs themselves. Head Start is a good example. There are people employed all over the country in Head Start, and with the kinds of changes that are coming to that program based on the policies that I reviewed, these people are going to be out of a job. Other actions can also increase costs for employers, even though it's deregulation. If there are not supportive activities for small business or big business or farmers, well, then they're going to have higher costs, and those higher costs are going to actually reduce jobs. So therefore, deregulation does not mean more jobs. It does not mean a healthy economy. Some of the regulation controls the way competition works. Make sure that it remains fair and that we don't spiral into an oligopoly. However, if you deregulate that, everything goes to an oligopoly, which is always the nature of a capitalistic system. Companies combine until there's only one left standing. That is the mathematics behind competition. If there is no regulation, you don't maintain capitalism at the level where everything is competing in a free market system. And that costs jobs. It also causes inflation, which we'll talk about in a bit. A large fraction of this week's documents probably have essentially no effect on the aggregate of employment. So the message would be, maybe mildly favorable to job creation or preservation, but nowhere near a major employment program. From the perspective of inflation, I'd give it literally a 3 on 5. Basically, and this is probably the weakest claim, there are many cost reduction policies, or should I say cost elimination, but remember, costs don't necessarily mean that those costs are unfair or that they're required. You have to put gas in your car. That's a cost you have. If I say you're not going to buy gas anymore, are you going to be able to do the job that you need? Is your car going to be able to do the job you need it to? No. Without gas, you can't run your car. And of course, that is kind of what some of these policies that have been implemented over the years and currently seem to be doing. Instead of improving efficiency and making sure that things are not wasting money, they're actually just chopping off programs and then if it's not there, nobody's doing it. Of course, less paperwork, lower regulatory burdens, faster permitting, infrastructure development. These can theoretically reduce production costs, but not necessarily, because some regulations control costs in the first place. So these are mildly disinflationary, but it's very mild. Most are simply too small or too sector specific, most of these policies, to move the national inflation appreciably one way or the other. There weren't any policies targeting inflation specifically. Some trade restrictions, regulatory costs, labor constraints, and some other stuff could push particular prices upward, actually cause it to get worse. So I would score the week essentially. I mean, as far as inflation goes, nothing positive was done for inflation from any of the policies that were implemented this week, despite claims. It just doesn't, it's not supported by anything in economics that I'm aware of. The environment was a big loser this week at 2.1 on a scale of 1 to 5. Here the signal is really strong. Our primary adverse effect analysis found that 23 of 218 substantive actions, which is roughly 10.6%, had environmental or conservation as a primary adverse effect category. So where 2.8% benefited, we're over 10% that definitely hurt conservation and the environment in which you live. Only 6 of the 218 had environment and conservation as a primary positive beneficiary, as I just said. That's almost a 4-to-1 imbalance in the primary classifications. There certainly are environmentally beneficial actions. If you're controlling pollution, doing risk evaluations, conservation-related measures, environmental reviews, etc., and they're done properly. Okay, we need to put that on there too. But these are all outweighed by deregulation, development, extractive industry promotion, permitting, pollution control, relaxation. I mean, the stuff going on in the Arctic Circle is definitely bad for the environment. It's also bad for the people who live up there. It's pretty much bad for everything. It doesn't even really help the oil industry that much. They'll just go around, drill a lot, and to see if there's oil where they should already know from the geologic surveys that have already been done. The Arctic drilling proposal reinforces that broader direction. Although technically it was published on August 6th, and I did review it, it isn't included in this 218 document list because it wasn't during this past week. It was just the day before it. So I'd characterize the environmental score as a fairly clear net deterioration in the environmental protection, but not a wholesale abandonment of environmental regulation. Do remember that when we talk about environment in my field, environmental sciences, we do not necessarily mean just the natural world. We talk about the socio-ecological environment, which is the social system in which humans operate, and the natural world, and the interactions and network between those, because of course humans depend on the natural world. So when we say environment in this context, it actually includes all of those social systems on which people depend, because those allow the natural environment to also survive. We are part of it. We're integrated with it. And we can't pretend that we aren't. The overall story, if I had to reduce the week's policy direction to three numbers: jobs 3.4 on 5, inflation 3 on 5, environment 2.1 on 5. This week's federal policy activity appears modestly oriented towards encouraging economic activity and employment, but there is little evidence that it would materially lower inflation, and some of those economic benefits appear to come at the expense of environmental protection. I would also give the three ratings different confidence levels, but I'm not going to go that deep because most people watching this wouldn't even really be concerned about that. Environmental consequences, though, are much more directly inferable from many of these rules than their eventual effects on the national inflation or employment. A lot of these policies that have been passed, it's clear that they're anti-environment. Some of them that might help jobs or help inflation, even at that level, it's pretty questionable. At this point, I'll stop. If you have any more comments or you'd like to watch more videos, subscribe to my channel or press the like button. Have a nice day, and I'll be reviewing more individual policies throughout this week. Have a nice day.